Tonight, Front Page Challenge welcomes the outspoken Negro leader, Malcolm X.
Sir, what's the real reason why you two men split? Is it merely ideological, or is it personality? What else?
Probably personality. It was not the statement that originally was given by the movement when we split. It's more personality than anything else.
You've called people like Martin Luther King, who just got a Nobel Peace Prize, an Uncle Tom. Is this correct, first?
Well, I'd rather say that in the States, there's a law that has recently been passed, or a decision handed down by the court, wherein if you call someone an Uncle Tom, they can sue you for libel.
Well,
so I never refer to them as Uncle Toms. I would say that Uncle Martin is my friend.
Uncle Martin is your friend, yet you would disagree with his approach to what he wants to accomplish.
Definitely. If his approach would bring about what the black man in America needs to completely eliminate the problem that we have, I would say well and good. But I very much doubt that anyone who adopts the approach that Martin Luther King has been teaching to our people in that country can point to any meaningful gains that has actually served to solve the problem.
Black Muslims have sometimes, whether you have or not, and I think probably you have sometimes, it seemed to me, been preaching hate to meet hate.
I don't advocate any kind of hate.
But there's a lot of talk that sounds very much like it.
No, I think that the guilt complex of the American white man is so profound until when you begin to analyze the real condition of the black man in America, instead of the American white man eliminating the causes that create that condition, he tries to cover it up by accusing his accusers of teaching hate. But actually, they're just exposing him for being responsible for what exists.
Well, that's something of an argument, but I've heard speeches made by some of the people of your group. I think I've heard you make speeches. It seemed to me that you were advocating what I would have to describe, I think, as violence to meet the serious injuries that have been done your people, with which I totally agree.
I don't call that violence. I don't in any way encourage black people to go out and initiate acts of aggression indiscriminately against whites. But I do believe that the black man in the United States, and any human being, anywhere, is well within his right to do whatever is necessary, by any means necessary, to protect his life and property, especially in a country where the federal government itself has proven that it is either unable or unwilling to protect the lives and property of those human beings.
What if I told you that America's greatest crime wasn't slavery itself, but the lie that came after it? The lie that the system was broken, when in truth, it was functioning exactly as designed. This wasn't the rant of an angry man. This was the calm, deliberate argument Malcolm X made in one of his most buried interviews. He didn't call America imperfect. He called it criminal. He didn't call racism a mistake. He called it policy. And when you hear the way he lays it out, step by step, you realize something chilling. The system never failed. It worked. By the mid-1960s, America was patting itself on the back. Civil rights bills have been signed. Martin Luther King Jr. was celebrated on magazine covers. Television cameras showed smiling black children walking into previously all-white schools. To the world, it looked like progress. But Malcolm cut through that illusion like a scalpel. He said, "Don't confuse optics with justice. Don't confuse headlines with reality." The problem wasn't whether a black child could sit in a classroom with a white child. The problem was whether that black child's family could afford a decent home, drink clean water, breathe clean air, and grow up free from police harassment. On paper, integration looked like a victory. But in the neighborhoods where Malcolm lived and worked, the reality was different. Why? Because racism wasn't a glitch in the system. It was the system. Let's rewind. Imagine you are a builder in the 1600s. You are designing a house. Not for family, not for comfort, but for profit. That house is America, and the blueprint is slavery. For 250 years, black bodies were treated as machines. Their labor built the economy. Their reproduction ensured free future workers, and their subjugation protected white wealth. The entire system, from law to religion to commerce, was designed to maintain that order. Then, suddenly, slavery ends. Does the house collapse? No, it adapts. Malcolm X argued that the so-called freedom of black people was never real freedom. It was a transition from one form of containment to another. The plantation was replaced by the prison. the overseer by the police, the whip by discriminatory laws. Each time black people fought for survival, the system invented a new mechanism to contain them. Sharecropping, convict leasing, redlining, voter suppression, police violence. If it looked like black people were constantly struggling, Malcolm insisted, that wasn't proof of the system's failure. That was proof of its success. One of the sharpest points Malcolm made was about the North. In the South, racism wore a hood and carried a whip. In the North, it wore a suit and carried a pen. The South was brutal but honest. Signs that said, whites only. Politicians who proudly declared segregation forever. But the North was different. It claimed to be liberal, progressive, colorblind. Yet in the ghettos of Chicago, Harlem, and Detroit, black families were trapped in poverty just as effectively as in Mississippi. Banks refused them loans. Landlords crammed them into crumbling buildings. Schools were underfunded, overcrowded, and neglected. And when black families dared to move into better neighborhoods, mobs appeared, not wearing hoods, but ties, protesting with picket signs about property values. Malcolm's point was brutal. Racism in the North was more dangerous precisely because it was hidden. The South was a wolf. The North was a fox. Both wanted to eat you. The fox just smiled first. America loves to tell the story of the melting pot, a place where Italians, Irish, Jews, and Germans came to the United States, faced hardship, but eventually assimilated and prospered. So why not black people? Malcolm's answer was simple. Because every immigrant group came voluntarily, chasing opportunity. Black people came in chains, stripped of language, culture, and land. Immigrants brought something to bargain with: skills, capital, or connections. Black people were seen as nothing but property. And here was the deadly twist. Immigrants often secured their place in America by climbing the ladder of whiteness, sometimes literally changing their names, their accents, their identities to blend in. The one group denied that ladder entirely: black people. No matter how educated, how wealthy, how accomplished, they remained locked outside whiteness. Malcolm used this truth to dismantle the narrative that racism was about ignorance or misunderstanding. It wasn't. It was about power. Whiteness had value only if blackness had none. And here's where Malcolm's interview became devastating. He didn't describe America's treatment of black people as racial discrimination or civil rights violations. He called it criminal. Think about that shift in language. Civil rights makes it sound like an internal dispute, a family argument within America's household. But criminal changes the entire frame. A crime demands accountability. A crime demands justice. A crime cannot be reformed away. It must be prosecuted. Malcolm wasn't saying America needed to improve. He was saying America needed to be put on trial. He compared the United States to a man who has committed murder but wants credit for stopping halfway. Imagine a man stabbing you 20 times, then pulling the knife out 10 inches and saying, "Look how much better things are." That, Malcolm said, was American progress. The wound was still bleeding. The damage still fatal. This is why Malcolm X's calm, measured words in this interview were more dangerous than fiery speeches. Anger could be dismissed as extremism. But logic? Logic was undeniable. If America was a criminal, then its leaders were criminals. If America's system was working as designed, then reforms were not progress, they were cover-ups. And if the system was working, then the only real solution wasn't begging for rights. It was dismantling and rebuilding the system itself. That was Malcolm's true danger. He refused to ask for inclusion in a burning house. He was telling the world. By the time part one of this buried interview ended, one truth was clear. America's racism wasn't accidental. It wasn't regional. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was policy. But here's the question Malcolm left hanging in the air. If the system is designed to oppress, how does it trick the oppressed into believing they are free? The answer to that is where Malcolm turned next. A warning about how America used not just chains, but illusions. What if I told you the greatest weapon of oppression was not chains, not whips, not even laws, but illusions? Illusions of freedom. Illusions of progress. Illusions of change. That's the warning Malcolm X delivered in this buried interview. He said the system doesn't just crush you with force, it pacifies you with symbols. It gives you victories to celebrate, while keeping the machinery of oppression untouched. And once you see how this velvet leash works, you can't unsee it. By the 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr. and the movement of nonviolence dominated headlines. Sit-ins, marches, boycotts, images of peaceful protesters being beaten and arrested filled television screens across America. The narrative was simple. Evil racists attack peaceful marchers, and eventually, justice prevails. But Malcolm saw something deeper. He warned that nonviolence, when controlled by the oppressor's narrative, could be turned into a leash. Here's what he meant. If the only acceptable form of protest is peaceful suffering, then any attempt at self-defense is automatically branded criminal. In other words, the system sets the rules of engagement. It says, you may protest, but only if you do so in a way that does not truly threaten U.S. And so, America used the spectacle of nonviolence to its advantage. Images of children being sprayed with fire hoses horrified the public, but they also served to portray America as a country that was working on its problems. The violence was framed as a local, southern issue, not a systemic one. And when laws were passed, the cameras moved on, while poverty, housing discrimination, and police brutality remained untouched. Malcolm called this out. He wasn't against nonviolence as a tactic. He was against it as a doctrine. Because a doctrine of nonviolence, he said, becomes a leash, one velvet enough to pacify, but strong enough to restrain. Malcolm knew the system loved symbols. Integration at a lunch counter, a handshake across racial lines, a black man in an Ivy League suit. These images were powerful, but they were also distractions. Take voting rights. The 1965 Voting Rights Act was hailed as a landmark victory. But what good is a vote if your community has no jobs, no schools, no hospitals, and no protection from police brutality? What good is political power if the economic system ensures you will always remain at the bottom? The system gave symbolic victories to mask the absence of structural change. It offered seats at the table, but never redistributed the meal. And for Malcolm, this wasn't progress. It was pacification. Another layer of the velvet leash was how America managed its heroes. Martin Luther King was portrayed as the saint of peace. Rosa Parks was remembered as a tired seamstress, not a radical activist who had long been part of organized resistance. Even Frederick Douglass, decades earlier, had been sanitized into a symbol of eloquent patriotism rather than a fierce critic of American hypocrisy. The system doesn't just oppress, it curates. It decides which black leaders to elevate and which to erase. It rewards those who fit its narrative of patient reform, and it demonizes those who expose its foundations. That's why Malcolm X himself was branded as violent, extremist, dangerous. Not because he called for violence. He didn't. But because he rejected the leash. He refused to let the system define the terms of his humanity. Here's the brilliance of the velvet leash. It makes the oppressor comfortable while appearing to grant concessions. March peacefully, they say, and we'll give you a holiday. Sing hymns, and we'll let you sit at the front of the bus. Write eloquent speeches, and we'll put your face on a stamp. But pick up a weapon in self-defense. You're a criminal. Demand economic justice. You're a radical. Call America itself guilty of crimes. You're a threat. The leash works because it allows just enough movement to create the illusion of progress, while keeping the system itself intact. So what was Malcolm's alternative? He called for self-respect, self-defense, and self-determination. He argued that black people had the right to protect themselves by any means necessary, not because violence was the goal, but because submission was unacceptable. He demanded that progress be measured not by symbols, but by substance. Not by how many black children could sit next to white children, but by how many black families could live in dignity, with access to housing, health care, education, and security. And he warned that as long as victories remained symbolic, the leash remained intact. Malcolm also exposed how America exported this velvet leash globally. To Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the United States presented itself as the beacon of democracy. It pointed to civil rights marches as proof of progress, telling the world, look, we are solving our race problem. But behind the curtain, it exploited resources and maintained military bases in nations fighting for independence. The same country that claimed to stand for freedom abroad was denying freedom at home. And the same illusions it fed black Americans, it fed the world. Symbols of change, masking systems of domination. This critique was lethal to America's image. Because if you strip away the symbols, what remains? A country that has never dismantled its structures of exploitation. A country that rewards obedience and punishes defiance. A country that replaces chains with contracts and whips with laws. That's why Malcolm X was silenced. Not because he was violent, but because he exposed the velvet leash for what it was, a tool of control more insidious than open brutality. By the end of this part of the interview, one thing was clear. America's most dangerous trick was not oppression itself, but the illusion of freedom. And Malcolm's question still burns. If symbols are not enough, if peaceful images are not enough, what happens when a people decide they will no longer suffer quietly? That's where Malcolm turned next. Not to violence, but to a word even more terrifying to the system: self-defense. What if I told you the most radical demand Malcolm X ever made wasn't about revolution, wasn't about separation, and wasn't about violence? It was about survival. In this buried interview, Malcolm said something that America could not allow to stand. He said, self-defense is not violence. It is dignity. It is the basic right of every human being to exist. And that single distinction shattered the system's narrative. Because if defending your life is a crime, then survival itself becomes criminalized. For decades, America painted black resistance as violence. Slave revolts were called massacres. Civil rights demonstrations were called riots. Black Panthers feeding children free breakfast were called extremists. Why? Because framing resistance as violence gave the system the moral upper hand. It allowed the state to respond with overwhelming force and call it law and order. But Malcolm refused that framing. He flipped it upside down. He said, when a man puts his hand on you, you have the right to send him to the cemetery. That is not violence. That is intelligence. He wasn't glorifying bloodshed. He was stripping away the system's monopoly on morality. If America celebrated its own revolution in 1776, armed resistance to British tyranny, why condemn black people for defending themselves against American tyranny? Malcolm also exposed the psychological chains that made many black people afraid of self-defense. Centuries of slavery and Jim Crow taught generations to accept abuse as normal, to survive by submission. Every lash, every lynching, every burning cross reinforced the message: if you fight back, you will die. This conditioning was so deep that even asking for basic survival was branded radical. But Malcolm argued that this fear was itself a weapon of the oppressor. If you can make a people believe their survival is dangerous, you can keep them enslaved without chains. One of Malcolm's sharpest arguments was about America's double standard. When white settlers took up arms against Britain, they were called patriots. When frontier families defended themselves with rifles, they were called heroes. When America dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was called necessary. But when a black man fought to protect his home, his wife, his children, that was called violence. That was called criminal. Malcolm exposed the hypocrisy. Violence, he said, was never the issue. The issue was who had the right to use it. And in America, that right was reserved for whiteness. But Malcolm's vision went deeper than street fights or riots. He wasn't simply telling people to pick up guns. He was calling for a redefinition of human rights. Self-defense, he argued, was the foundation of dignity. If a man cannot protect his family, he is not free. If a woman cannot defend her body, she is not free. If a people cannot resist their own extermination, they're not free. And here's the devastating truth. Malcolm was not speaking hypothetically. He was speaking in a time when police shot black men without consequence, when mobs burned black families out of their homes, when entire communities, like Tulsa in 1921, were destroyed with impunity. To tell black people not to defend themselves in that environment was not a call for peace. It was a demand for death. So why did America fear Malcolm's call for self-defense so much? Because it exposed the fragility of the system. The entire structure of white supremacy depended on black compliance. It depended on the assumption that violence would only flow in one direction. If black people began to believe in their right to fight back, not to attack, but to defend, then the cost of maintaining oppression would skyrocket. The balance of terror would shift. The velvet leash would snap. Malcolm's message was simple but seismic. We are not asking permission to live. We are declaring our right to exist. And this is where Malcolm elevated the argument to another level. He said the problem was not civil rights. It was human rights. Civil rights framed the struggle as an internal American issue, a matter for domestic courts and Congress. But human rights? That placed the struggle on the global stage. It said, Black Americans are not a minority asking for charity. They are people facing crimes against humanity. And crimes against humanity are not judged by the guilty nation itself. They're judged by the world. This was Malcolm's masterstroke, and America's nightmare. Because if the world recognized Black oppression as a human rights violation, then America could be dragged before the Court of Nations, its hypocrisy exposed. Let's be clear, Malcolm never called for indiscriminate violence. He never advocated attacking innocent people. What he demanded was balance. If the state brings dogs, hoses, and guns, then the people have the right to defend themselves with equal force. If a mob invades your home, you have the right to protect your family. To deny this right, Malcolm said, was to reduce Black people to less than human. Because even animals defend themselves. To ask a people to suffer quietly in the face of brutality is not morality. It is cruelty disguised as virtue. And this is why Malcolm's calm words in this interview carried more weight than any fiery speech. Because he wasn't appealing to anger. He was appealing to logic, to common sense. And that logic left America cornered. Because if self-defense is human dignity, then to condemn it is to admit that Black lives are not human lives at all. It forced the nation to confront a chilling question. Was its true expectation not peace, but submission? By the time Malcolm reached this point in the interview, the air was heavy with unspoken truth. He had dismantled the illusion of progress. He had exposed the velvet leash. And now, he had declared that survival itself was the most radical act of all. But Malcolm was not finished. His vision stretched beyond America's borders. Because he knew that the fight for survival was not just Black America's fight. It was global.
The problem, number one, of the Black man in America is beyond America's ability to solve. It's a human problem, not an American problem or a Negro problem. And as a human problem or a world problem, we feel that it should be taken out of the jurisdiction of the United States government and the United States courts and taken into the United Nations in the same manner that the problems of the Black man in South Africa, Angola, and other parts of the world, and even the way they're trying to bring the problems of the Jews in Russia into the United Nations because of violation of human rights. We believe that our problem is one not of violation of civil rights, but a violation of human rights. Not only are we denied the right to be a citizen in the United States, we're denied the right to be a human being.
What if I told you Malcolm X's most dangerous idea had nothing to do with America at all? It was global. In this buried interview, Malcolm declared that the struggle of Black Americans was not a civil issue. It was a human rights crisis, a crime against humanity, and he wanted to take that case before the world. That single shift from civil rights to human rights was enough to terrify the United States government more than any march, any protest, any speech, because it threatened not just America's domestic order, but its international image, its alliances, and its power. For years, civil rights leaders framed their demands within the language of American democracy. They appealed to the Constitution. They cited the Declaration of Independence. They said, live up to your own ideals. But Malcolm saw the trap. If the struggle remained a civil rights issue, then it was confined within America's courts and Congress, the very institutions built to maintain white supremacy. Civil rights, he said, made Black people beg for recognition as citizens. But what if the nation itself was illegitimate in its treatment of them? What if the very laws and institutions they appealed to were guilty of crimes? That's why Malcolm rejected the civil rights frame. He said this wasn't about asking to sit at the American table. This was Abu. Malcolm's strategy was bold and unprecedented. He wanted to take America to the United Nations, charging it with human rights violations against Black people. Think about what that meant. The U.S., at the height of the Cold War, was trying to present itself as the global leader of democracy. It pointed to the Soviet Union as the oppressor, the villain, the empire of tyranny. Now imagine Malcolm walking into the halls of the United Nations in Geneva or New York and laying out evidence. Centuries of slavery, lynchings, Jim Crow laws, police killings, economic exploitation. Imagine him telling newly independent African nations, Asian nations, Latin American nations, "This is the same America," lecturing you about freedom. The fallout would have been catastrophic. By the 1960s, Africa was in the middle of a revolution. Nation after nation was breaking free from colonial rule. Ghana, Nigeria, Congo, Kenya, new flags were rising, new leaders were emerging, and these nations were watching America closely. Because America wanted them as allies in the Cold War, wanted their resources, their votes in the United Nations, their loyalty in the global chessboard against the Soviets. But Malcolm X exposed the hypocrisy. How could America claim to support freedom in Africa while denying freedom at home? How could it criticize apartheid in South Africa while enforcing segregation in Mississippi? By linking Black America's struggle to Africa's liberation, Malcolm created a bridge the U.S. government could not control. If African nations sided with Malcolm, America's credibility abroad would collapse. Malcolm also saw that Black America's struggle was not unique. It was part of a global pattern. In Algeria, the French had colonized and brutalized the people. In Congo, Belgium had exploited resources and lives for decades. In South Africa, apartheid reigned. Everywhere, the colonizer used the same playbook: control through violence, pacification through illusion, extraction of wealth, and suppression of resistance. Malcolm's brilliance was showing that America's treatment of Black people fit this same pattern. It wasn't an exception. It was part of the global machinery of white supremacy and empire. This is why Malcolm X was more dangerous abroad than at home. Because he could connect struggles. He could unify voices. If the U.S. was put on trial for human rights abuses, it would lose its moral high ground. It could no longer position itself as the shining city on a hill, the champion of democracy. The Soviet Union would seize the propaganda victory, and newly independent nations in Africa and Asia would think twice before aligning with Washington. In short, Malcolm threatened America's empire, not just its image. And so, America did what it always does to threats it cannot defeat logically. It assassinated character. The media painted Malcolm as a dangerous radical, a violent extremist, a hate preacher. Newspapers ran caricatures of him with guns and sneers. Politicians dismissed him as divisive. This wasn't just about silencing his words. It was about ensuring his message never reached the global stage. Because if the world heard Malcolm calmly, logically, surgically indicting America, the illusion would shatter. And if you shatter the illusion, you expose the crime. By the time of this interview, Malcolm X knew the danger he was in. He said openly, "I live like a man who is already dead." He wasn't exaggerating. He had been followed by the FBI, monitored by the CIA, targeted by infiltrators, smeared by the press. Every move was watched, every word recorded. And yet, he spoke with calm precision. Because he understood something most people fear to admit. A man who no longer fears death is unstoppable. And that's what terrified America most. Not his anger, not his rhetoric, but his clarity. Malcolm X was assassinated in February 1965, just weeks after returning from Africa, where he had met with heads of state and revolutionary leaders. He was on the verge of bringing the case for Black America's human rights to the world stage. His body was killed, but his idea survived. Every liberation movement that came after, whether in South Africa, Palestine, or the Caribbean, echoed Malcolm's global vision. The Black Panthers adopted internationalism. Pan-Africanists carried his flame. Even today, when people speak of systemic racism as a global issue, they are walking the path Malcolm laid down. And here's the truth that America still struggles to bury. Malcolm X was not hated because he was violent. He was hated because he made sense. He was not feared because he carried a gun. He was feared because he carried evidence. He was not silenced because he shouted. He was silenced because he spoke calmly, logically, undeniably. He didn't ask America to be better. He put America on trial. And in doing so, he left a legacy that still echoes. If survival is a crime, then existence itself becomes resistance. And if oppression is global, then freedom must be global too. So here we are, decades later, still haunted by Malcolm's words. The machine still works. The velvet leash still restrains. The right to exist is still contested. And the global system of oppression he named still casts its shadow. The only question left is this. If Malcolm X was right, and history suggests he was, then why are we still calling it progress when the machinery has never stopped? If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it, so others can see the truths that were never meant to be told. Like this video, if you believe history should never be buried. And most importantly, subscribe to this channel, because the stories they tried to erase, the voices they tried to silence, we will keep bringing them back to life. Together, we make sure they are never forgotten.